As an African-American woman and filmmaker, I've seen and documented my share of political protests. Depending on the issues, you could pretty much predict what the makeup of the crowd would be. So I was struck by the protests of 2020, when so many people reacted to the killing of George Floyd. It wasn't the longevity of the protests or even the nature of them. It was witnessing the increasing numbers of white people marching and protesting in support of Black Lives Matter. They were in the streets of our largest cities and our smallest towns. I asked myself, why? There had been police shootings before, but why the numbers now? Were white people finally beginning to understand the injustices that Black people have had to endure for more than 400 years? Was it because the pandemic left people unemployed and therefore able to spend the day protesting? Was it a trend or simply a fad? In my search for answers, I found there were white people and white organizations that were actually talking to other white people about racism, white supremacy, and white privilege, and that organizing is growing. There are groups like Showing Up for Racial Justice, White People for Black Lives, and even Rednecks for Black Lives. This film is just a sample of what I found.
Black people do not need our rescue. They need us to stand side by side and challenge power, challenge institutions that are continuing the racism and equity and oppression since the founding of this country.
White supremacy it's a very charged term. I was raised to see that term as meaning people wearing white hoods. And of course, it includes people who would wear white hoods. It's also a highly descriptive sociological term to describe the society we live in, society that elevates white people as the norm.
I love my white people, and I do not want white supremacy to turn my white people into weapons against people of color.
My parents were pretty racist. They were pretty prejudiced. They were trying to be as American as they could. And I don't know if it's because they were working class, they also didn't think they had the luxury of sharing any negative aspect of their body or their history, for fear that they wouldn't make it in this new world. They didn't want to be thought of as anything less than absolutely 100% white US citizens.
It's better in this country to look like me than it is to look like, Ta-Nehisi Coates. I wasn't taught that I'm better than anybody else overtly, but I think beneath the surface, that's exactly what we're taught.
It's short of wearing a white hood. I think most white people would not see themselves or somebody else as racist, because we're taught that a racist is an individual who consciously doesn't like people based on race and is intentionally mean to them. Individual conscious malintent across race. And that virtually exempts all white people from the system we live in. I'm really clear that I have perpetrated racism in my life, and that I still do on occasion. And I can assure you that not one incident of that was ever conscious or intentional. It still wounded other people. It still came out of my racist conditioning. It still had a racist impact.
People of color didn't invent racism. White people did. And so it was never about going off by ourselves and just doing our thing. It was always about an accountability with people of color-led movements. It was also those stepping in or showing up in our responsibility to be part of dismantling racism. Because white people are the folks who made it up.
Well, let's go back a little bit to SNCC. SNCC told us to go into the white community. And we were like, I don't think so. But I mean, we were imagining going into the white community of the South. Like I had an experience where I went to bail somebody out of the Greenwood jail during the summer of '64. I brought the money. He was a black SNCC worker. I posted the bail. And then I go out of the building and there are 5 steps and there's a man holding a baby, white man holding a baby, and he pushes me down the steps. So the anger of the white Southerners and then other white SNCC folks had tried to dip their toe into some of those white communities and they were completely rejected and run out of town. And so working in the white community was not something that we could embrace.
If the only folks organizing to create space for white people to talk about race are the Klan, then that's who organizes white people on race. And so white anti-racists, we need to start getting really skilled at building spaces, organizations, discussion groups, cultural events, political protests that bring white people into racial justice, as opposed to the Klan organizing white people into white supremacy.
I think for me, it didn't really come together until I was out of college. And I had been involved in the campaigns against David Duke when he was running for Senate and governor. And, you know, I watched 670,000 white people vote for a man that we all knew was not just a white supremacist and an ex-Klansman, but a Nazi in every sense of the word. And I remember sitting with that and trying to figure out what that meant and beginning to realize that in that particular moment, right, Black folks had really saved white Louisianans from having a Nazi for governor or for US senator. So you start to sit there and think about whose responsibility is it really to save white people from ourselves?
For me, very early on, it was this idea of choosing sides, and I came to understand that as a white person, I needed to be speaking out and taking action, because otherwise I was playing into the silence of the majority of white people that I knew and that I saw who were not saying anything.
I think one of the most dangerous versions of white supremacy that I see around me today is, I guess I would say, white inaction or white freezing. Just being like, I feel so bad and I don't know what to do. And there are so many ways that I could maybe try and help, but they all are different and I don't know what's the best one. And I don't want to do the wrong one because then people will be mad at me. And so I'm just not going to do anything. I'm just not going to do anything because I don't see myself in this struggle, because I'm too scared of making a mistake, because I don't want to actually risk the comforts that I have in my life. And we have to move past that. We have to be willing to make mistakes. We have to be willing to risk the comforts that we have in our lives.
I don't care how great a white person I might think I am in my heart or even in my mind. If I am not putting my body out there in the work, if I am not willing to talk to other white people to get my neighbors to come down to the rally with me, then I am not chipping away at the silence, which becomes the justification by our leaders in this country for business as usual.
I think the work of SURJ and similar organizations that have been explicit about creating spaces for white people to come into the movement, to work out our stuff, you know, and we got a lot of it, but, you know, to create a political home for white people who are realizing this is a problem and want to do something about it, has really helped build a groundswell among white people in white communities.
People who are in the streets, we've got to maintain that pressure, that public pressure of being in the streets and holding. And I know that a lot of organizations and people are trying to intersect that new energy with trainings, with nonviolent direct action training. I live in a basketball state and am a former basketball coach. So I think of it as a full court press. We just have so many lanes to fill and so many pressure points to put on the ball. And so we don't need everybody doing the same thing. We do need people and organizations filling these different lanes.
So that awareness that young white folks now have of like, oh, this is happening still. This is happening right now. This has been happening since you were a kid, and it was happening before you were born, and it's going to keep happening until you do something about it.
And I think that's what Rednecks for Black Lives and the affirmation we've seen and the identity we've seen. with people in the South and the rural South and beyond, is saying, I'm a poor white person. I'm maybe in the South. I'm maybe the last person you think that's going to stand up for Black lives and defend Black lives. And here I am. I'm doing it.
If you organize white people from the place of, we have been used, we have been duped, white supremacy is a lie that is teaching us to hate people who we actually should be forming deep bonds of beloved community relationship with, who we should be uniting with. And anti-racism is key to economic justice for all, is key to multiracial democracy for all. Anti-racism is key to a healthy society for all of our elders, all of our children, and we want to fight like hell as white people to join with Black-led multiracial movements for racial justice, because it's the right thing to do to end this death culture in communities of color and Black communities. And this is about us as white people refusing to be machines, refusing to be tools, reconnecting to our hearts, reconnecting to our humanity, and rejoining the rest of our people in multiracial beloved community for justice.
There's a certain degree of empathy and sympathy that I could have, and I sort of started to view the work that I do as profoundly pro those people. In other words, not only is it not anti-white people, it's pro those people, trying to actually say to them, no, you have legitimate pains in your life. The problem is that whiteness and white supremacy are keeping you from seeing what the source of that is. And a lot of that pain is white supremacy. A lot of those white folks in Louisiana were in pain precisely because whiteness told them their lives were always going to be good. Whiteness told them if they just worked hard, doubled down, worked 50 hours a week, they would have a better life than their parents, and their kids would have a better life than their parents. And then when the system didn't work out that way for them, right, they had to lash out. And they lashed out at those below them because that's a lot easier than lashing out at those above who lied to them. But I got nothing for love for those people, nothing but love for those people, in the sense of really wanting them not to suffer anymore. But the difference is, I'm not going to indulge their bullshit about why they're suffering.
And, the chicken for us has finally come home to roost. People who are Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have been feeling this pain and feeling this loss literally for centuries. And now white people are too, and it's making us question on like a cellular level, why? And we can't just keep looking at other people anymore. We can't keep looking at the people that the power elite tell us to blame for our problems anymore, because you know what? It's just like that case just doesn't hold enough water right now. There's too much pain going around, and the explanations that they're giving us are just not good enough. And I think people are finally, the veil has been lifted and they're finally seeing it for what it is.
I believe that it is really important for us to engage white people in this moment, to understand that this is not just about today, but this is for the long haul. If we go home and back to the silence that represents the majority of people in this country, then we are not going to be able to be part of the change that's needed.
It means creating new pathways for folks to understand where they come from. I think that it's an easy and slippery slope sometimes to be like a white, cisgendered, heterosexual man, Christian, Protestant from the South, and be like, well, I'm screwed because I have nothing. I have nothing to stand on in terms of like positive tradition. I have nothing to do. And that's not true. I mean, there's plenty of people that we can look at as our ancestors who fought the good fight as white people, as white men, as white cis het men. There need to be more. I mean, it would be great if there were more. And so now's the time to build that generation of more. And I think that's the work, is building that generation of more folks who are willing to throw down for freedom movements.
I think what's important for white people to know is that we have a firmly rooted legacy of white folks, fighting against the white supremacist system. And so we have role models that are white, we have role models that are Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. And we don't have to look that far to get to it. So, there are folks that like Ann Braden, there are folks like Viola Liuzzo, who was, you know, a white woman who was killed during the civil rights movement. We have the Grimsky sisters, as you know. So there are so many people. We have John Brown, who many say, you know, his actions, however debatable it was in the historical context, were precursors to the Civil War. So, like, you know, we have models of ways that we can look at how anti-racist action can look on a variety of different levels. And they also exist today. And we follow the leadership of and the wisdom of those who are most impacted by this white supremacist system. So even, you know, current leaders from Patrisse Cullors to Melina Abdullah to, you know, Yvette Ale to, you know, there's so many people that we can look at locally and nationally as folks that are really our thought leaders and supporters to get us to liberation.
The organizing mentality for anti-racist work in white communities had also been evolving, because in the 90s and the early 2000s, the emphasis was more on white people. You need to know that racism exists. You need to know that you're racist. You need to know that you have privilege. You need to know that your people have caused mass suffering in communities of color. You should feel ashamed of who you are, and now go out and do something about it. But if you are completely immersed in guilt and shame, and you think that you and other white people are the problem, it's hard to move into a place of how am I going to proactively work to make positive change.
I don't particularly mind if somebody comes to the table because they're feeling guilty, but get over yourself. We've got work to do. And the concept of white privilege, I get pushback on this like anyone else does, that this idea that I have privileges because of my white skin, that instantly throws a lot of white people into feeling guilty. Just like the word reparation scares the crap out of a lot of white people. It's like, wait, you're gonna take all my money and give it to, you know, Black people? And I'm gonna have to give up my house and my, you know, whatever. And it's like, give me those conversations. I think that these are the really important ones. And the idea of white privilege isn't something that, you know, what it is that I have a set of advantages that are built in because I have lighter skin than my darker skinned colleagues and friends. And that's the reality of racism.
The only other thing I just want to say about like how I, what allows me not to hate myself around racism and the racism that lives inside of me. I think it's just that like I have found my home in movements for racial and economic justice, and those movements saved me. Like I get so much repaired from my childhood and everything that was wrong, so much repaired from the systems that I've suffered under, like as a child and adult. And I think that that is part of what allows me to move on and continue moving, is because there's so much beauty and joy and power and purpose in doing this kind of work. And it's transformed me. And I'm just trying to create spaces for other white folks, in particular for those of us who are coming from deeply broken families and communities, to be able to experience how beautiful that is, to be on fire for it, and to continue doing that fight.
I hope that the lesson will stick, and that we'll be, but it seems to me that those of us who do this work must take advantage of this window opening right now to get that attention and to say, do not forget how vulnerable you're feeling right now. And please know the reason you're feeling that way is because a long time ago, we created a hierarchy of human value in this culture. And we created it so that people like you would always be on top and you'd always be okay. But every now and then, once you've created that mentality, you don't get to contain it in that little space that says white folks will be fine, Black folks will be the ones to die. Because at some point, once you've created that notion of a hierarchy, they'll come for you when you're sick. They'll come for you when you're old. They'll come for you when you are immunosuppressed or frail. And they don't care whether you live or die either.
I think that one of the top questions I get from Black people is, why should white people care? I can only imagine looking out at where we are, what we have, what we hold, and you would wonder that. But there is, of course, an incredible cost to maintaining inequality. We are highly manipulable. We can be made to vote against our best interests. There are many things that would serve us so well, like universal health care and good access to public education, and on and on. This would serve everybody. But because we have this kind of scarcity mentality in this sense of we deserve this, you don't, we are set up to have such a profoundly unequal society. And more wealth is concentrated in fewer hands today than ever in recorded history. That also hurts white people. But we get distracted by turning over here and saying, oh, it's the immigrants, or it's affirmative action, or these type of things. So it absolutely serves us. But for me, just in a values level, you know, I deeply believe in justice, and I need to align what I say I believe with the actual practice of my life. If I'm not seeking that in an active way, then that is actually a disingenuous claim.
One of the tricks, the insidious tricks of white supremacy, in my opinion, is that white people don't have to believe that they're bound by their people. They could be just who, they could just be. They could just be this individual thing that exists and controls everything. I think recognizing who your people are is becoming human again, you know, is a part of being a divinely created human thing, you know, a human being. And I think that is part of it too. It's like there's a value in working with our folks to rehumanize ourselves, and to, again, not get all wallowed up in the guilt of the past, but be really committed to the work of the present and the future around responsibility for doing this stuff, because it literally our families' lives are at stake.
And a really clear understanding that I think becomes more and more clear, especially, you know, during COVID, and we've seen just massive evictions, and we'll see more job loss, lack of health care, and just really the impact of that. And also the uprisings, that it's become really clear. And I think it's becoming clearer to poor white people to see our stake in this, to know that when we are in defense of Black lives and Black people have safety and self-determination and the things they need to live and thrive and have joy and safety, then we will have those things too.
And I don't blame any person of color who's maybe sitting back in the moment and saying, is this going to last? How long is this going to last? Is this going to be real? I don't blame any skepticism that might be out there. And I'm also hearing from people of color about hope in this moment and belief in this moment. And it's not going to happen, though, out of these first 60 days. We've got to stay the course in terms of on those multiple points of pressure and keeping this going, and just refusing to live in that kind of society anymore.
That is, I think, really core to where we go from here, is we try and make sure that all of the non-Black people who are showing up for this moment are not just coming here to show up for a few protests, take a few photos, go home and say, did I check my boxes? Did I go to a protest? Did I pay my debt? Yes, I did. Okay, that's great. Now I go back to my life and I live my life the way I was already living it. We need people to internalize and begin to embody the struggle against white supremacy in every part of their lives, in their relationships, in their families, in their practices in business, and in the ways that they sustain themselves, all of it. And I think that we can only really do that if we help people connect themselves, see themselves as part of the picture, see themselves as part of what this struggle for liberation is about.
The wealth of this country was built on the backs of Black slaves, the land taken from Mexico, land stolen from indigenous people, and those who have ruled this country have benefited incredibly from that. I believe that the white people who will actually play the largest role in dismantling racism and white supremacy will be those white people who are also oppressed by an economic system that benefits the few at the expense of the many. And so to me, our focus should be on who are the other white people that are hurting. Let's get them, let's have them join people of color who have been hurting and who have a vision of the way forward, and together, we can rattle this system and we can change it.
Because of these and other efforts, the conversations that white people are beginning to have amongst themselves just might make their interaction with Black people a little less awkward and more authentic. Only then can we all come together to fight this battle and move from protests and marches to the hard but critical task of dismantling systemic and institutional racism for good.